Now that we've talked about some non-vascular bryophytes, let's continue up and begin our discussion on vascular seedless plants. So why is vascular tissue so important? The evolution of vascular tissue enables plants to invade drier environments and grow taller. One important concept is the fact that vascular tissue can only grow in the sporophyte. The gametophyte tissue does not have that ability. Think about that. If vascular tissue enables plants to grow in drier environments and grow taller, and vascular tissue can only grow in the sporophyte tissue, how would you expect that to affect the life cycle of plants further up on this evolutionary tree? What do you think might happen to the gametophyte stage in plants? You can make some predictions as to how those plants might evolve and which stages would become dominant. This is how you can use evolution to predict function and form, and inform your predictions by examples in the real world. What is vascular tissue? We'll divide vascular tissue into two kinds, xylem and phloem. Xylem conducts most of the water and minerals, and it includes dead cells called tracheids. Much of the time that water is located underground, so xylem has a job of moving water up against the force of gravity. Phloem distributes sugars and other byproducts of photosynthesis throughout the plant wherever it's needed. That includes fruits, flowers, or wherever the plant is actively growing. We'll use pteraphytes as an example of vascular seedless plants. Pteraphytes are the ferns. Pteraphyte consists of two word roots. Ptera means wing, and phyta means plant. Here's the life cycle of a fern. We'll start from meiosis. After meiosis, spores are created, and this is where we go from a diploid tissue to a haploid tissue. Those haploid spores grow into young gametophytes, just like in the mosses. In this case, the gametophytes are bisexual, and they contain the ability to make both sperm and egg. The movement of sperm through the environment is facilitated by water or raindrops. Again, this stage is very water dependent. The gametophyte tissue is very sensitive to drying out. When an egg is fertilized, it then produces a zygote. That zygote begins growing into a new sporophyte. The sporophyte has the ability to grow vascular tissue. It quickly dominates the vegetative growth stage of this plant. The mature sporophyte is massive, orders of magnitude larger than the gametophyte. The mature sporophyte then produces more spores from the sori beneath a fertile frond. Not all of the leaves on the sporophyte produce spores. You can see an example of a fertile frond on the bottom right. Those dots, while sometimes called spores, are actually collections of sporangium. Each dot is called a sorus. Those sporangium do contain spores. Let's look at a simplified version of the fern life cycle. On the bottom left you have the spore, which is one end. It's haploid. It lands in a suitable environment and then starts growing into a gametophyte. When an egg on the gametophyte is fertilized, the embryo then develops into a sporophyte. The sporophyte begins growing on top of the gametophyte, just like in the mosses. In this case, the sporophyte tissue has the ability to photosynthesize. It continues growing and, aided by vascular tissue, becomes the dominant vegetative stage in the life cycle. The sporophyte is huge, many times larger than the gametophyte. Finally, the sporophyte produces more spores through meiosis, and again goes from diploid to haploid. Let's compare the two simplified life cycles of moss and ferns. In the mosses, the gametophyte is one-end tissue. That photosynthesizes and is the dominant vegetative stage. Finally, when an egg is fertilized at the top of a female gametophyte, a sporophyte develops. The sporophyte is diploid. As soon as the sporophyte is done developing, it undergoes meiosis and produces spores. The sole function of this stage is to bring in new genetic material, mix it up, and then distribute those spores slightly higher in the air column. Remember that meiotic events are important in creating the diversity that natural selection needs to act upon. In the fern life cycle, you can see again we have a spore and the growth of a gametophyte. When that gametophyte is fertilized, the sporophyte is produced. This time the sporophyte is green because it photosynthesizes, and it begins growing much larger than in the moss. The sporophyte becomes the dominant vegetative structure. Finally, the sporophyte undergoes meiosis and creates more spores. Now that you can see these life cycles side by side, think about which life stage is the most vulnerable to drying out. The sporophyte dominance in the fern allows it to grow in drier environments, further away from water, or in conditions that have less predictable water availability. Here you can see a gametophyte of the fern. It's really, really small. But you can see that it's also been fertilized and a young sporophyte is growing at the top. This is one of the last times that you'll be able to see gametophyte tissue and sporophyte tissue in the fern life cycle. As soon as that sporophyte gets a certain size, the gametophyte just withers away. The young developing leaves in ferns are called fiddleheads, and you can see those in the middle. They're called that because they look a lot like the head of a fiddle. On the bottom right, you can see that ferns have dominated the landscape. While this area might be somewhat moist, it's probably too dry for mosses to grow. Here's another example of a fern that's taken that life history cycle into a new dimension. These are called elkhorn ferns or staghorn ferns. Many plants can grow off the ground. They're called air plants or epiphytes. This fern grows as an epiphyte in tropical regions of the world. To maintain moisture, these ferns grow special fronds that are made to die and collect at the base of the plant. That collection of dead leaf material absorbs and holds water during periods of no rain. Here's another kind of fern. These are called tree ferns. In order to outcompete neighbors for light, these ferns grow on stacks of old dead tissue. This is another example of evolutionary function through form. The vascular tissue and dead tissues below create a platform through which the ferns can grow taller and taller, allowing them to access a limiting resource in these moist tropical environments, which is sunlight. Now that we've talked about ferns and pterophytes, let's move on to vascular seeded plants. Remember, one of the main challenges we've overcome through the development of vascular tissue is the ability to resist drying out. Plants can also grow much larger with vascular tissue. But the ferns and club mosses are still vulnerable during their gametophyte stage. That means that they're somewhat limited to moist environments or areas that have more water availability. As we move up the evolutionary tree, the next most important state change is the evolution of seeds. Both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms produce seeds. We'll first talk about the gymnosperms, and lastly, the angiosperms. On the left is an example of a seedless plant, a lycophyte. These are in the same group as the ferns. Its reproductive structure, or where spores are made, is called a strobolus. You can see in this cutaway of the strobolus that megaspores and microspores are formed. You can think of those as female spores and male spores. The seeded plants also have differentiated spore production. The gymnosperms produce seeds on what's called ovulate cones. These cones can also be thought of as female cones. The male cones are called staminate cones. On the bottom you can see these staminate cones are much smaller and produce pollen in really high numbers. That pollen gets distributed by wind into the landscape. Here's a life cycle that illustrates the production of seeds in a gymnosperm. Before we go through the life cycle, it's important to keep in mind those evolutionary influences that have gotten us to this stage. The gametophyte stage is reduced and protected. Remember that the gametophyte stage in ferns and mosses was always sensitive to drying out and moisture dependent. While we go through these life cycles, keep in mind how plants have overcome the challenges of distribution gravity, and drying out on land. Let's start at meiosis. Meiosis on this life cycle is split up into two parts. One occurs from the microsporangium and results in pollen grains. The other occurs in megasporangium and results in the production of an egg. You can see those pollen grains have to land in a very specific place in order to pollinate the ovule. When an egg is fertilized, it becomes an embryo. The embryo is surrounded by one end tissue, and that serves as a food reserve. If you notice on the bottom right, we have the presence of the female gametophyte. The developing embryo is surrounded by gametophyte tissue. Now the gametophyte serves as a food reserve to help the developing embryo get through those first vulnerable stages of a seedling before photosynthesis can occur. Finally, the mature seeds are released into the environment. The 2N diploid seedling will then grow into a mature sporophyte. In this case, the sporophyte is massive. Mature gymnosperm sporophytes represent some of the largest organisms on Earth. Our coastal redwood trees and our sequoia trees are both kinds of massive, mature gymnosperm sporophytes. On the top left, you can see several different fossils representing different kinds of gymnosperm seeds through evolutionary time. Below them, you can see some illustrations to show you more clearly their shape. On the right are modern gymnosperm seeds. These seeds are from a pine tree. What challenge do you think these seeds are trying to overcome in their shape? Now's a good time to make some predictions as to how you think the shape of the seed might be affected by its form and structure. Remember that form and structure are important concepts when talking about evolutionary design. Which one of these seed morphologies do you think would be most successful at moving the seed further across the landscape? Would it be the oldest seeds on the very left, or the modern seeds to the right? Well, luckily, a group of researchers did this test. They made three-dimensional models of all of these seeds and dropped them to the air to see which ones fell faster or which ones fell slower. This is an example that illustrates the way that natural selection selects for a better form over time. You can see that the more modern seed shape is better at slowing the seed's fall, giving it more time to be carried through wind across the landscape. Now that we've talked about the reproductive cycle of gymnosperms, let's look at some examples that you might encounter outside, in gardens, or when you're traveling around. All three of these plants are gymnosperms. On the top left is a group called the cycads. Cycads also grow cones, but their cones are massive and singular in the center of a palm-like whorl of leaves. Even though cycads grow incredibly slowly, they are also incredibly long-lived. Some individuals that are hundreds of years old can be several meters high. Many species of cycad are endangered or very rare. This species of cycad, called Encephalartos woodii, is extinct in the wild. The only examples we have are clones from a single individual that's grown in a botanical garden. Cycads are long-lived, rare, and depending on who you ask, pretty beautiful. That means that they're also very collectible. There's a huge black market for stealing and selling cycads. Many of them are under intense surveillance or are chained underground in order to deter people from stealing them. Still, the value of cycads to collectors drives an underground economy and conservation issues throughout the world. Ginkgo biloba is what's known as a living fossil. Examples of ginkgo in the fossil record look very similar to individuals that are alive, almost indistinguishable. Ginkgo biloba is not just a survivor over large evolutionary timescales, but also can survive conditions that most other organisms can't. To this day, 6 individual ginkgo trees are known to have survived within 2 kilometers of ground zero of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb. Another interesting gymnosperm is Welwitschia mirabilis. You may or may not have heard of Welwitschia. There's a model of one placed in the Africa room at the Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. Welwitschia is a cool example of a gymnosperm that's adapted to really, really extreme environments. Welwitschia lives in these dry deserts of Africa. Welwitschia grows 2 leaves. Those 2 leaves continue to grow throughout the life of Welwitschia. Here, it looks like this individual has a lot of different leaves, but those are actually only 2 leaves that have been split. They continue to grow throughout the life of the plant from the base. The tips die and fray. Eventually, the dead frayed tips form a clump of dead material at the base of Welwitschia. That dead material forms an area of higher relative humidity around the base of the Welwitschia and protects it from the dry desert air. Another interesting gymnosperm are the araucarias. The common name of these trees is the monkey puzzle tree. They have an incredible form and grow in similar conditions in South America as are sequoia and redwood trees here in California. Because of that, you can see araucarias planted in neighborhoods as ornamental trees. They grow pretty well here, but if you sit under an araucaria tree, you're always in danger of being hit by one of those massive cones.